Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So today I got a fun and exciting video for you guys today, and something that's going to be coming soon to 3DS Emulation in Azahar. That is because some of the developers previewed a new feature that I think is going to be an absolute game changer when it comes to enjoying 3DS Emulation on your PC or on your handheld, however you want to play it. Because I've been saying for the longest time now, since Azahar kind of took over for Citra, it is absolutely an outstanding emulator that can do some amazing things. But like any emulator that deals with 3D in an area that doesn't have the exact same hardware, you have a problem with hitching when it comes to caching the shaders so that your modern GPU can actually interpret them and draw graphics. And that's something that we saw maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and I was talking about Azahar in a tutorial and saying that sometimes you have to play through an area in the game at least once to get all those shaders cached and ready to go so that you don't end up with that hitching, which is basically just a technical limitation, but it's one of those things. Do you really want to have to play through a game multiple times before you can actually sit down and play it without all of that hitching and caching going on in the background? And that's basically what this new feature is going to be, but I kind of want to lay a baseline down so you understand what shader caching is in the first place. Now the 3DS has a GPU inside of it, but of course that is a kind of custom part that really doesn't have much in relationship to your modern GPUs in your PCs, whether it's AMD or it's NVIDIA. And they have their own shaders that can draw graphics from the 3DS, but those need to be interpreted. So basically a cache is a saved file, so that when that cache gets called up in a shader call again, it doesn't have to actually cache it, it can just execute it, and you basically never notice it's happening in the background. But of course those caches have to be made first, because the first time you play any game that features a shader that Azahar hasn't seen for that game, it has to compile them, and that just leads to the hitching and slowdown we see here. Now, if we take a look at one of the developers' Twitters here, he basically put up a photo, and most people didn't notice it was actually on the code on the screen, but I noticed this one before he actually explained that it was really fun and kind of indicative of what's coming. Because if you take a look at the code here, you're going to see mentions of caches, you're going to see mentions of Vulkans, and you're going to see mentions of basically being able to deal with shader caches and bringing them in before they actually need to be done. And I totally get it. Most people saw this photo, myself included, and thought to themselves, hey, there's 2 cute budgie riggers up there. That really is kind of the lead. And I love that the developer basically said that those 2 birds are in charge of actually coding all of Azahar. They do an incredible job, in my opinion at least. But as an explanation of this, because most people missed it, they're dealing with the Vulkan render right now and basically pre-compiling shaders that'll be portable and be able to be loaded in before you actually play the game. Because even on something like Dead or Alive here, which I talked about in how to make 3DS look like a 4K console video, and I will leave a link to that in the description below, you will see micro stutters here and there, and that's just because it had been a little bit since I played this game, and it was probably on an old version of Azahar. So you always have to deal with that when you're dealing with 3DS emulation, and it's not like 3DS is the only console that has to cache as well. You see that a lot on something like RPCS3 on the PlayStation 3 side of things as well. But again, once you actually have that cache built in, you don't notice it as much, and now with the Vulkan render features coming soon, that's also going to be something that is available. But think of it this way, and I'll get a little bit more in depth in a minute. If somebody's played the game and they have a shader cache, why isn't that something that you could just potentially grab and pop in before you play a game, so you don't actually have to wait for your version of Azahar to be able to cache all of that? Because something like Resident Evil Resolutions on the 3DS, a 10 out of 10 amazing game, but when you do have to deal with the hitching and the overall weird cadence until all those shaders have been cached, it can kind of drive you a little bit nuts. And there really isn't any way around this, just because modern GPUs versus the GPU on the 3DS are doing things completely differently. Emulation isn't just dealing with the underlying game code and how that executes, it's also dealing with all of the sound hardware, all of the GPU hardware, to be able to make sure that that can effectively run on a modern system. And that is no easy thing to do whatsoever, and it has to be fast enough so that you don't notice it in the background. And as far as the shaders are concerned, they have to be cached at least once, because otherwise you would be getting no graphical output on your screen, because it would basically have no idea what it was supposed to draw and how it would actually draw that. So you'll see here Pablo MK7 also explains that to you, and how those shaders work and how they have to be cached and rendered before anything is going to show up on screen, and even how this step is very time consuming, and that's why most new games stutter when they're loading new scenes. But now that is going to be changed up a little bit so that you're not going to have to deal with those stutters in the future. And I'm going to give you a soundtrack sample as well, and you can see the footage here. This is something that I had played before, and it did have a cache, so it's one of those things, didn't really have any issues, and you can see it in the footage, and I'll be right back. Now, because I had played Majora's Mask on Azahar before, I had that shader cache there and was able to effectively just kind of deal with what it needed to. You'll see here they mentioned though Vulkan on the other hand lacked that functionality, so they had to recompile shaders again as needed by the game. But now you're going to have a disk shader cache coming in that can be preloaded to prevent stutter, and it is going to be portable. And you'll see one user here, the Handleable Gamer, said, "Oh shit, we need to set up a repo with the full shader dumps." Basically what that is saying is if you want to play something like Resident Evil Revelations or any other game you could think of on the 3DS, if there is a repo with those shaders cached, you're just going to be able to add that into Azahar, preload them, and you won't have that hitching to deal with on the Vulkan renderer, because the shader cache is going to be identical basically across every single game as far as how it's built. Sure, there might be some differences between AMD and Nvidia because of course they are different companies with different GPUs. We're talking about the potential with the Vulkan render just to be able to grab a shader cache and start playing a game and not having to deal with all of that hitching. Because when I do videos on 3DS emulation, especially Azahar, people always talk about the fact, how do you get rid of the hitching? Is something going wrong? And I think that's because a lot of people don't understand what the shader cache truly is and don't understand how you basically have to rebuild those shaders in real time to run on that modern hardware. It's just one of those things. Even though the 3DS can absolutely look like a modern console if you give it all these enhancements in Azahar, the reality is the hardware running all the video side of things is basically ancient at this point in time. And it's like any sort of silicon. There's going to be different instructions, there's going to be different shaders, and they have to be transposed before they will work. You'll see we are getting a few hitches here, very small, but it does impact the overall gameplay. And honestly, I totally get why that drives some people nuts, because you just want to sit down and play a game without thinking about what's happening in the background. But it is just a reality of this era of emulation. You're always going to have to deal with that shader cache at least once. But now on the Vulkan render, because they're going to be portable and going to be able to pre-cache, I feel like maybe in like 3 to 6 months you're going to see some repositories out there where this is basically going to be taken care of for you. Because if there's one thing the overall fan emulation community takes care of, it's something that makes the games easier to play. And that's definitely going to be a lot of fun, because at least for me personally, playing 3DS via Azahar is my preferred method now. Because there's just something about upscaling these games to 4K, playing them on my LG C4 OLED, they just look absolutely stunning. And don't get me wrong, I do love my 3DS hardware. I have not one, not two, but 3 different handhelds of different area sizes and generations, because Nintendo loved playing around with that, just like the DS, and I will play them, maybe sitting in bed every once in a while. But now, unless I want 3D, I will go over to my Steam Deck and basically play 3DS games handheld that way. Because this Vulkan renderer feature is going to be part of Azahar, you don't need to be sitting at your Windows PC to be able to enjoy it. Now, it isn't out yet, but I was so excited about this feature, I figured I would do a preview video. When it actually shows up, I will definitely cover it and how it functions. And this is just directly after Azahar got one of the biggest updates it's ever got since it started development, so honestly, the future of 3DS emulation is looking absolutely bright. I think we're going to be getting more and more fun stuff, because that is just how good the emulation community truly is. They're always coming up with more ideas to add into the emulators, and this one to me absolutely is going to be one of those key clutch features that once you experience it, you're never going to be able to go back to the old way of doing things. Because again, every single time I do a 3DS emulation tutorial, I tell people that the shader caching and the hitching is something they're just going to have to deal with. No, it's not the emulator working incorrectly, it's just part and parcel the way that these things get made. And that's why I always love using Revelations as an example of the caching, because it seems to hit Azahar and any 3DS emulator harder as far as the cache hitches are concerned than any other game. So imagine in the future being able to grab a portable shader cache for Vulkan rendering, dropping it into a folder on the Azahar installation, and being able to go through this entire area in something like Revelations without any hitching whatsoever. That is a future I definitely want to live in. I think it's a future you want to live in, and it's a future the developers of Azahar are currently working on and should be out soon. But if you have any questions or comments on how shader caches work, if I haven't explained something that you're curious about, leave me that comment down below and I'll try to answer each and every one of you. But get hyped for this. It's going to be an absolutely massive deal. It's going to change the way you interact with Azahar in the 3DS, and I can't wait to see it. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.